My family cut me out, but what they didn't know was my secret millions. And it all started with a simple silver locket. The scent of worn wood and lavender always brought me back here, to this very spot. It clung to the air in my little cottage, a comforting embrace that time had somehow forgotten, unlike so many other things. The evening light, softened by the lace curtains I'd crocheted with my own 2 hands decades ago, cast long, dancing shadows across the room. It was a familiar ballet, one I'd watched countless times as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of apricot and rose. Tonight, though, the shadows felt different, heavier, as if carrying the weight of untold stories. My granddaughter Lily sat cross-legged on the faded Persian rug at my feet, her small, earnest face upturned, framed by a halo of sun-kissed curls. She was a breath of fresh air, a whisper of spring in the autumn of my life, and her presence was the only thing that truly tethered me to the present. Her innocent eyes, wide and curious, reflected the flickering flame of the oil lamp on the mantelpiece, mirroring the questions that often sparked within her. She was holding my hand, her tiny fingers gently tracing the labyrinth of wrinkles that age had etched onto my skin, each line a testament to a life lived, a battle fought, a joy embraced, a sorrow endured. "Grandma Marietta," she began, her voice a soft melody, barely a whisper above the gentle crackle of the fireplace. "Tell me about the locket again, the one you said was the start of everything." I squeezed her hand, a warmth spreading through me, chasing away some of the chill that always seemed to linger in my bones these days. The locket. Ah, yes, the locket. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was an anchor, a compass, a silent witness to a life that had twisted and turned in ways I never could have imagined. My voice, thinned by years and sorrows, still held a quiet strength, a resilience forged in the fires of hardship. That locket, my sweet Lily, holds a story of love and loss, of hope and betrayal. It's a story I haven't told. Many, but you, my dear, you deserve to hear it all. I leaned back into the plush cushions of my armchair, the velvet worn smooth in places from countless hours of reading and reminiscing. The memories, like old photographs, began to sift through. The archives of my mind, some sharp and vivid, others softened by the passage of time. They were moments that had shaped me, carved me, almost broken me. But I wasn't broken. Not entirely. "I was barely older than you, Lily, when I first saw that locket," I began, my gaze drifting to a framed, sepia-toned photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger me, my hair dark and lustrous, my eyes full of a youthful optimism that life would soon challenge. My mother, God rest her soul, had just passed and left me with my father. He was a good man, a hard-working man, but grief had a way of turning even the kindest souls into ghosts. We lived in a small 2-room house then, nestled in the valley, where the scent of pine needles and damp earth was a constant companion. Money was always tight, a whisper of worry in every corner of our lives. My mind, as it often did, drifted back to those early days, to the bitter chill of winters and the long, sun-drenched days of summer spent toiling in the fields alongside my father. He was a farmer, and I, his only child, was his shadow, learning the rhythm of the land, the language of the crops. I remembered the rough feel of burlap sacks against my young shoulders, the ache in my back as I bent over rows of vegetables, the sweet, earthy smell of freshly tilled soil. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and a quiet dignity that was, in its own way, a kind of wealth. One blustery autumn day, when the leaves were a riot of fiery colors and the wind carried the promise of snow, my father brought home a small, ornately carved wooden box. He placed it on our worn kitchen table, his hands, calloused and strong, trembling ever so slightly. My heart fluttered with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. We rarely had anything new, anything that wasn't a necessity. "Marietta," he'd said, his voice raspy, "this was your mother's, her mother's before that. A legacy passed down through the women of our family." Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay the locket. It was crafted from sterling silver, with intricate engravings of blooming roses and intertwining vines. The surface, though, dulled by years, hinted at a forgotten brilliance. I picked it up, its cool weight a comforting presence in my palm. It wasn't gaudy or extravagant, but it held an undeniable elegance, a silent story within its closed embrace. It felt important. "It's beautiful, Papa," I'd whispered, my voice thick with awe. He'd smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It holds a secret, Marietta, a secret about our family, about where we came from. Your mother always said it would reveal itself when the time was right. It's yours now. Guard it well." I wore that locket every day from that moment on, its silver chain a constant cool touch against my skin. It became a part of me, a silent companion through the trials and tribulations of my youth. My father, bless his heart, worked tirelessly, his body growing more stooped with each passing year, to ensure I had an education. He believed in the power of knowledge, a rare sentiment in our small, rural community where most girls were destined for marriage and motherhood by their late teens. I, however, had dreams that stretched beyond the valley, dreams whispered to the wind and held close to the beat of my locket-clad heart. My first betrayal, a subtle whisper of what was to come, arrived in the form of a letter. I was 18, brimming with the naive optimism of youth, and had just received an acceptance letter to the local teachers' college, a triumph that felt monumental, a direct result of my father's unwavering support and my own tireless efforts. I remember the sunshine streaming through the kitchen window that morning, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, making everything seem brighter, more hopeful. My aunt, my mother's sister Clara, a woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye for opportunity, had arrived unannounced. She was a formidable woman, always impeccably dressed, her hair meticulously coiled, a stark contrast to our rustic simplicity. She owned a small but thriving general store in the nearest town and always carried with her the scent of spices and ambition. "Marietta, dear," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "your father and I need to speak with you." I remember the unease that settled in my stomach, a cold knot tightening with each beat of my heart. My father, usually so stoic, avoided my gaze, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. It was then I knew something was terribly wrong. The V. "Farm isn't doing well, child," my aunt had begun, her voice dripping with a feigned sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Harvests have been poor, and your father, well, he's getting on in years. He can't keep up the work like he used to. And with your mother's medical bills, and now your college tuition, it's simply too much." My heart sank. I knew the farm had struggled, but I hadn't realized the extent of it. My father had always shielded me from the harshest realities. "We've discussed it, and your father agrees," Aunt Clara continued, her eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on me. "The farm is heavily mortgaged. The only way to save it, to keep a roof over your father's head, is if you marry." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marry? But I had plans, dreams, teacher's college, a life of my own, a future that stretched far beyond the confines of our valley. I looked at my father, pleading with my eyes, begging him to contradict her, to tell me it wasn't true. But he only stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "There's a man," my aunt continued, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. "Mr. Henderson, a widower from the next town over. He's older, yes, but he's well off, and he's willing to pay off the mortgage on the farm in exchange for your hand." I felt the blood drain from my face. Mr. Henderson. I knew of him. A stern, humorless man, known for his vast land holdings and his even vaster reputation for being a miser. The thought of being bound to him, of my dreams being extinguished before they even had a chance to ignite, was suffocating. No, I whispered, the word a fragile defiance against the crushing weight of their expectations. No, I can't. I have college. I have my future. My aunt's smile vanished, replaced by a tight, thin line. Don't be foolish, Marietta. This isn't about your whims. This is about family, about responsibility. Your father needs this. Are you going to be selfish and let him lose everything? The accusation stung, raw and unyielding. Selfish? All I had ever known was sacrifice, working alongside my father, giving up my childhood to help him. Was pursuing my own path, truly. Selfish? I looked at my father again, his face etched with sorrow and resignation. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He couldn't. He was trapped, and in his desperation, he was pulling me down with him. Please, Papa, I begged, my voice cracking, tears stinging my eyes. Don't make me do this. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own. I'm sorry, my girl. I truly am. But there's no other way. The words were a hammer blow to my heart. My own father, the man who had always been my rock, my protector, was sacrificing me for the farm. For a piece of land that held more value to him, it seemed, than my own happiness. The silver locket, warm against my skin, suddenly felt heavy, an ironic symbol of the legacy I was being forced to abandon. My dreams, the future I had meticulously planned, shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces around me. The betrayal was complete, a bitter taste in my mouth, a wound that would fester for years to come. I spent the next few days in a haze of disbelief and despair. The vibrant colors of autumn seemed to mock my inner turmoil, their beauty a cruel contrast to the bleak landscape of my future. I stopped eating. My appetite vanished, replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in my stomach. I barely spoke, my voice choked with unshed tears. My father, remorse etched across his face, tried to talk to me, to explain, but his words felt hollow, offering no comfort. My aunt, on the other hand, bustled around, making arrangements, discussing dowries, as if she were planning a grand celebration rather than a funeral for my hopes. She even suggested I sell the locket, hinting that its silver could fetch a decent price, a notion I vehemently rejected. It was my mother's, a piece of her, and I would sooner part with my own skin than with that sacred heirloom. I remembered one particularly cold evening, the wind howling outside, rattling the windows of our small house. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, the locket clutched in my hand, its cool metal a small comfort against my burning skin. Lily, I can still feel the profound sense of loneliness that enveloped me then, a chilling realization that I was utterly alone in this. My own family, the very people who were supposed to protect and cherish me, had become the architects of my despair. It wasn't just the prospect of marrying Mr. Henderson, though that was a grim enough fate. It was the feeling of being disposable, of my worth being measured against a mortgage and a tract of land. It was the crushing weight of knowing that my dreams, my aspirations, meant so little in the grand scheme of things. It was the first time I truly understood the bitter truth that sometimes the ones who are supposed to love you the most can inflict the deepest wounds. But even then, a tiny spark of defiance, a nascent ember of resilience flickered within me. I might be forced into this marriage, but I wouldn't be broken by it. I would find a way, somehow, to reclaim my life, to salvage the shattered pieces of my dreams. The locket, a silent witness to my vow, felt heavier now, imbued with a new purpose. It was no longer just a memento. It was a promise to myself that I would not let this betrayal define me. And so, Lily, I said, my voice trailing off as I gently touched the locket, still nestled against my collar. That was the first crack. the first time the world showed me its sharp edges. It wasn't the last, not by a long shot, but even in that moment of despair, something awoke in me. A quiet understanding that if I was to survive, I had to learn to stand on my own 2 feet, no matter how shaky they felt. Lily, her eyes still wide, leaned into me, her small hand reaching up to touch the locket. "But Grandma, why didn't your father fight for you? Why did he let Aunt Clara do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with a child's confusion at such a profound injustice. I sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Sometimes, my dear, people are trapped by their own circumstances, by the burdens they carry. My father loved me, I truly believe that. But he was drowning in his own despair, his own fears. He saw no other way out. And sometimes, when people are desperate, they make choices they later regret, choices that cause pain to the ones they love. I paused, stroking her soft hair. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the locket held more than just a family history. It held a secret that would, years later, change everything. I looked at Lily, her innocent face a mirror of the young girl I once was, before the world had etched its lessons onto my soul. It was a secret that lay dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A secret that would prove, in the end, that while they thought they had taken everything from me, I had always held a power they could never imagine. The chaw. Fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind outside seemed to whisper secrets of its own. I tightened my grip on Lily's hand, a silent promise passing between us. The story had just begun. What do you think happened next to young Marietta? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The day I married him wasn't the day my dreams died. It was the day I learned how to bury them alive, nurturing a single seed of hope in the dark, waiting for a spring that might never come. Lily's small fingers tightened around mine, her brow furrowed with the kind of righteous indignation only a child can truly possess. "But that's not fair, Grandma. He was your father. He was supposed to protect you." The firelight danced in her eyes, turning their soft blue into a stormy sea of emotion. Her outrage was a balm on a wound so old I'd almost forgotten. It was there. It was a testament to the purity of her heart, a heart that hadn't yet learned the world's harsh calculus of survival and sacrifice. I smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Oh, my sweet girl," I murmured, my voice a low, steady hum against the crackling of the logs. Fairness is a luxury the world doesn't always afford. Sometimes all we can do is endure the storm and learn to find our own light in the darkness. And that's what I had to do. I had to learn to live in a gilded cage. The memory of my wedding day isn't one of white lace and joyful bells, but of muted grays and the heavy toll of a church bell that sounded more like a death knell. I stood at the altar beside Arthur Henderson, a man twice my age, his face a mask of stern propriety. He smelled of mothballs and stale money. His hand, when he placed the cold, simple gold band on my finger, was dry and brittle, like old parchment. I looked out at the sparse pews. My father was there, his face a canvas of guilt, his eyes fixed on the worn toes of his boots. Aunt Clara sat beside him, a triumphant, almost predatory gleam in her eyes, her lips pursed in a thin, self-satisfied smile. She had secured the family's future, and the cost, my future, was a price she was more than willing to pay. I walked out of that church, not as Marietta, the girl who dreamed of books and blackboards, but as Mrs. Henderson, a title that felt like a shroud. The life that followed was one of quiet, suffocating opulence. Arthur's house was a mansion, a grand, imposing structure with polished marble floors that echoed my lonely footsteps and windows so tall they seemed to look down on me with disdain. Everything was pristine, orderly, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a house, not a home. Arthur wasn't cruel in the way of a brute. He never raised his hand to me. His cruelty was a more refined, insidious kind. It was the cruelty of indifference. I was his possession, a beautiful, well-behaved object to be displayed at dinner parties and business functions. He provided me with a generous allowance, but every penny was accounted for. He bought me fine dresses, but always in colors and styles he preferred. Somber, muted tones that seemed to drain the very life from my face. My opinions were never sought, my thoughts never considered. I was a ghost in my own life, a silent curator of his perfect, sterile world. The first few years were the hardest. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant, hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried to visit my father, hoping to find a sliver of the connection we once shared, but our conversations were stilted, choked with the unspoken words of his betrayal. He'd ask about my health, about the grand house, his eyes filled with a pained sort of pride, as if my gilded cage somehow justified his decision. He never asked if I was happy. I think he was too afraid of the answer. Aunt. Clara, on the other hand, was always effusive, her compliments dripping with a cloying sweetness that made my teeth ache. She would talk about how well the farm was doing now, how they'd been able to afford a new roof for the barn, all thanks to my wonderful match. Each word was a tiny, sharp stone hurled at my heart. I was their savior, and their gratitude felt like chains. I learned to find solace in small things. The vast library in Arthur's house became my sanctuary. I devoured books, losing myself in stories of adventure, romance, and faraway lands. The characters in those pages became my friends, their triumphs and sorrows a welcome distraction from my own muted existence. I also found a small, neglected corner of the sprawling estate grounds, and, with the grudging permission of the head gardener, I started my own garden. I plunged my hands into the rich, dark earth, feeling a connection to the life force that I so desperately craved. I planted roses, their vibrant colors a rebellion against the drabness of my life. I nurtured lavender and chamomile, their calming scents a balm to my frayed nerves. That small patch of earth became my kingdom, the only place where I felt I had any control, where I could create beauty and life with my own two hands. And then, after 5 years of this hollow existence, a miracle happened. I discovered I was pregnant. The news was like the first ray of sunshine after a long, brutal winter. For the first time since my wedding day, I felt a flicker of genuine joy, a profound sense of purpose. This child, my child, would be a reason to live, not just exist. Arthur was pleased, of course, but in a detached, proprietary way. He had his heir. It was another asset acquired, another box checked in his meticulously planned life. But for me, this child was everything. He was the anchor that would keep me from drifting away completely. Lily's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Is that when my dad was born?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded, my own eyes misting over at the memory. "Yes, my love. That's when your father, Daniel, came into my life. I can still recall the moment they placed him. In my arms, a tiny, perfect bundle of life, his small fingers instinctively curling around mine. In that instant, the cavernous loneliness inside me was filled with a fierce, all-consuming love. I looked into his innocent, trusting eyes and made a silent vow. I would protect him. I would love him enough for 2 parents. I would make sure. He never felt the cold indifference that had defined my life. Raising Daniel became my sole focus, my magnum opus. I poured all my thwarted ambitions, all my buried dreams, all my desperate love into him. I read to him every night, filling his imagination with the stories I had once cherished. I taught him the names of the flowers in my garden, the songs of the birds in the trees. I tried to instill in him a sense of wonder, of kindness, of empathy, all the things that were so glaringly absent in the Henderson household. But Arthur had other plans. As Daniel grew, his father began to mold him in his own image. He taught him about ledgers and stock portfolios, about assets and liabilities. He ingrained in him the belief that a man's worth was measured by the size of his bank account. He would scoff at the frivolous pursuits I encouraged, like painting or reading poetry. "That won't put food on the table, Marietta," he would say, his voice laced with disdain. "The boy needs to learn the value of $1. A quiet war was waged for Daniel's soul. On one side, there was my world of love, creativity, and emotional connection. On the other, his father's world of logic, ambition, and cold, hard cash. I saw the conflict in Daniel's eyes, the way he was torn between his affection for me and his desire for his father's approval. As a boy, he would run to me with scraped knees and bruised feelings, burying his face in my lap, seeking comfort. But as he grew into a teenager, I felt him pulling away, drawn into the powerful orbit of his father's influence. He started spending more time in Arthur's study than in my garden. He began to talk about profit margins and market trends, his words echoing his father's. I remember one afternoon, Daniel was about 16. He came to me, a troubled look on his face. He needed money for a school trip, a cultural exchange program to Italy that he was desperate to go on. He'd been studying art history, a passion I had secretly nurtured in him, and this was his dream. When he asked his father, Arthur had dismissed it as a waste of time and money. "He said it has no practical value, Mom," Daniel said, his voice laced with the bitter disappointment of a teenager whose dreams have just been crushed. My heart ached for him. I had a small fund I'd been secretly saving for years, skimming a little here and there from my household allowance. It was my escape fund, a tiny nest egg I kept hidden just in case. Without a second thought, I gave it all to him. "Don't tell your father," I whispered, pressing the wad of bills into his hand. "This is our secret. Go to Italy, see the world, fill your soul with beauty." He'd hugged me then, a tight, grateful embrace that felt like a throwback to his childhood. For a fleeting moment, I felt like I had won, that love had triumphed over avarice. But I was naive. When he returned from Italy, he was full of stories about Michelangelo and Botticelli, but he also spoke with a new, cynical tone about the commercialization of art, about how much a particular sculpture was insured for. His father's lessons were taking root, twisting something beautiful into just another commodity. He thanked me for the money, but there was a distance in his eyes. He had seen the world, and it had taught him his father's language. Through all these years, the locket remained my constant companion. It was my tangible link to my mother, to the life I'd had before it was so cruelly rerouted. In the long, lonely evenings, after Arthur had retired to his study and Daniel was busy with his schoolwork, I would sit by the window, turning it over and over in my fingers. I traced the intricate carvings of the roses, feeling the smooth, cool silver against my skin. It was a habit, a nervous tic, a form of meditation. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I noticed it. I had been fiddling with the delicate clasp, the one that opened to reveal the tiny, empty frames where pictures were meant to go. But my finger brushed against something else, a slight ridge along the filigreed edge of the locket. It was almost imperceptible, seamlessly integrated into the design of the intertwining vines. I pressed it. Nothing happened. But my curiosity was piqued. I examined it under the light of my reading lamp, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. It wasn't just a decorative flaw, it was a mechanism, a tiny, hidden button. Over the next few weeks, trying to open that secret compartment became my private obsession. It was a puzzle, a mystery that was mine and mine alone. I tried pressing the button while twisting the lid, sliding it, pushing it. Nothing worked. It was as if it was sealed shut by time and secrets. The locket, which had always been a symbol of my past, now felt like a promise for the future. What did my father mean when he said it held a secret that would reveal itself? When the time was right? Was this it? The thought was a thrilling, terrifying whisper in the silence of my life. Years passed. Daniel went off to college, then business school, becoming the man his father had always wanted him to be, sharp, ambitious, and emotionally detached. He was successful, and I was proud of him, but there was a chasm between us, a space filled with unspoken things. He would visit on holidays, his conversations polite but superficial. He'd kiss my cheek, ask after my health, and then spend hours closeted with his father, discussing business. I had become a background character in my own son's life. Then, one brisk autumn morning, Arthur had a massive heart attack in his study. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I should have felt something: grief, relief, freedom. But all I felt was a profound, unnerving emptiness. The cage door was open, but I had been inside for so long I had forgotten how to fly. The will reading was a week later. It was a cold, formal affair, held in the office of Arthur's lawyer, a man with a face like a clenched fist. Daniel sat beside me, his expression unreadable. I wasn't expecting much. Arthur had never seen me as a partner, only as a dependent. But even I was unprepared for the final, posthumous act of cruelty. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice dry as dust. "To my beloved son, Daniel Henderson," he read, "I bequeath my entire estate, including all properties, stocks, bonds, and controlling interests in Henderson Enterprises." He paused, adjusting his glasses, and looked at me over the rims. "To my wife, Marietta Henderson," he continued, "in recognition of her years of service, I bequeath a lifetime stipend of $500 per month, to be administered by my son, Daniel, contingent upon her continued good behavior and her remaining in the family home under his care." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as shards of glass. Years of service, stipend, contingent upon good behavior, under his care. I wasn't his wife. I was his employee. I wasn't a widow. I was a dependent, and my own son was now my warden. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign of outrage, of protest. There was none. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw set. In that moment, I saw not my son, but his father's ghost sitting beside me. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it stole the air from my lungs. I had been a burden to my father, and now I was officially a burden to my son. That night, I didn't sleep. The grand, empty house felt more like a prison than ever before. The silence was deafening. I was a guest in what had been my home for over 40 years. I sat in my room, the lawyer's words echoing in my mind. Good behavior. Under his care. The cage had just gotten smaller. A cold, hard resolve began to form in my heart. I would not let this be the final chapter of my story. I would not fade into obscurity, a charity case in my own home. I had endured too much, survived too long, to be erased so easily. My fingers, as if with a will of their own, went to the locket, at my throat. I unclasped it, its weight familiar and comforting in my palm. The hidden button seemed to mock me, a secret I had never been able to unlock. My gaze fell upon the small sewing kit on my dresser, the one I used for mending Daniel's clothes when he was a boy. I picked up a sturdy needle. My hand trembled, not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and freedom. I pressed the tiny, hidden button with my thumb, and at the same time, I inserted the tip of the needle into a minuscule slit I had never noticed before, right where the hinge met the body of the locket. I applied a gentle, steady pressure. For a moment, Nothing. Then, with a soft, almost inaudible click, a sound I had been waiting decades to hear, the engraved front of the locket sprang open on a hidden hinge. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a space for a picture. It was a hollow compartment, no bigger than my thumbnail. And nestled inside, on a bed of faded, threadbare silk, lay a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and something else. A small, strangely shaped, antique brass key. They thought they had left her with nothing, but they forgot about the one thing that was truly hers. What secret do you think the paper holds, and what lock does that strange key open? Let me know in the comments. The world saw me as a fragile old woman with nothing to my name. But the tiny paper in my locket told a different story. It was a stock certificate, and it was the first thread I would pull to unravel a life I never knew I had. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of my chest. The air in my room, usually so still and familiar, felt charged with a sudden electric potential. My fingers, gnarled and trembling with age, were surprisingly steady as I used the tip of a hairpin to gently, painstakingly unfold the brittle yellowed paper. It was no bigger than a postage stamp, and the ink on it was faded, a ghostly brown script from a bygone era. But the words were still legible, etched into the fiber of the paper as if by the very weight of their meaning. It was a stock certificate. 100 shares of the Keystone Mining Consortium issued to one Elspeth Dubois, my mother, my maiden name. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the worn quilt a soft anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. My mother had owned shares in a mining company. My mother, who I remembered as a gentle soul with flour on her apron and a lullaby on her lips, had been an investor. It made no sense. We had been poor. We had struggled. My father had sold my future to save a failing farm. This piece of paper was a contradiction, a ghost in the ledgers of my life. And then there was the key. It was small, brass, and ornate, with the number 317 stamped into its head above a small, unfamiliar crest, a lion holding a scale. It was clearly a key to a safe deposit box, a box my mother had kept, its contents a complete mystery. The locket, my silent companion for over 60 years, had suddenly spoken, and its voice was a thunderous roar of questions. Why had my mother never told my father? Or if she had, why had he never used this to save us? Was his grief so profound that he had simply forgotten? Or was this a secret she had deliberately kept from him, a legacy intended only for me? The possibilities were a dizzying kaleidoscope of what-ifs, each one more painful than the last. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception, a quiet rebellion waged from the confines of my armchair. Daniel, now the undisputed lord of the manor, began to change. The grief he'd shown for his father, a stoic, respectable grief, quickly faded, replaced by an air of restless ambition. The house, once a tomb of oppressive silence, was now filled with the boisterous laughter of his business partners, the sharp scent of expensive cigars, and the constant, jarring ring of his cell phone. He moved through the rooms with a proprietary stride, his presence shrinking my world until I felt like a mouse scurrying along the baseboards. "Mom," he said one afternoon, breezing into the sunroom where I was tending to my orchids, not even making eye contact as he scrolled through his phone. "I'm having some clients over for dinner this week. We'll need this room for cocktails. Could you make sure your things are out of the way?" My things. He meant my orchids, my books, the small watering can that had been my mother's. He meant my very presence. I looked at him, at this man I had brought into the world, this boy whose scraped knees I had kissed and whose nightmares I had chased away. I saw the impatience in his eyes, the casual dismissiveness. I was no longer his mother. I was an inconvenient piece of furniture, a relic from a previous administration. The word his father had used in the will echoed in my mind. Service. My service, it seemed, was no longer required. It was this casual cruelty that hardened my resolve. The frail, grieving widow was a role I would play to perfection, but behind that mask, a strategist was emerging. My first move was to secure my assets, the locket and its contents. I carefully refolded the certificate and placed it, along with the key, back into the hidden compartment, the click of its closure a silent declaration of war. My stipend, the paltry $500 a month Daniel administered with a sigh of heavy-handed generosity, became my war chest. My sanctuary, the library, became my war room. Citing a need for fresh air, I began taking a taxi to the town library twice a week. It was an extravagance that earned a raised eyebrow from Daniel, but he said nothing, likely relieved to have me out of the house. The librarians, kind women who knew me from my younger days, helped me navigate the bewildering world of the internet. I felt like a spy from another era, hunched over a glowing screen, my fingers awkwardly tapping at the keyboard. My first search was for the Keystone Mining Consortium. As I suspected, it was long gone. Page after page of search results yielded nothing but historical footnotes and dead ends. A cold knot of despair began to form in my stomach. Was this all a cruel joke? A piece of worthless paper from a defunct company? Was the hope that had flared within me just another illusion? Lily shifted on the rug, her small face a mask of concern. "But you didn't give up, did you, Grandma?" she asked, her voice a soft plea for a happy ending she wasn't, yet sure existed. I reached down and squeezed her hand. "No, my dear. I was too old to give up. When you get to my age, you realize that time is too precious to waste on despair." I changed my tactics. Instead of searching for the company, I started searching for historical business acquisitions, for the corporate sharks that had swallowed the smaller fish. It took days of painstaking research, of following convoluted paper trails through online archives of financial newspapers. And then, I found it. A small article from a 1958 edition of the Wall Street Journal. Keystone Mining Consortium hadn't gone bankrupt. It had been acquired by a larger company, a national conglomerate called Consolidated Resources. My heart leaped. The trail wasn't cold after all. The next step was more difficult. I had to find out what had happened to the shares. I knew I couldn't just call Consolidated Resources and ask. I needed proof of ownership, and I didn't dare reveal my hand yet. More digging. I learned about stock splits, dividends, mergers, and unclaimed property laws. It was a foreign language, but I was a determined student. I discovered that when a company is acquired, its stock is often converted into shares of the new parent company. If those shares are never claimed, they are held in trust, continuing to accrue value, splitting and multiplying like a hidden financial garden. The numbers, when I finally managed to do a rough calculation, were staggering. 100 shares. In 1958, through half a dozen subsequent mergers and decades of stock splits, had blossomed. It wasn't a small nest egg, it was a fortune. A fortune so vast it made Daniel's inheritance look like pocket change. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, not with age this time, but with the sheer, earth-shattering magnitude of my discovery. All those years I had spent feeling poor, feeling dependent. This wealth had been sitting there, waiting, a silent testament to a mother I now realized I had never truly known. The key was the next puzzle, the lion and the scales. I spent an entire afternoon poring over a digital archive of old bank logos and insignia. Finally, I found a match. The Merchants' Trust Bank of the Commonwealth, a prestigious regional bank that had been the cornerstone of the financial community for a century before it, too, was swallowed by a series of mergers. Its modern incarnation was a name I knew well: Global Financial Union, one of anodyne, monolithic banks that now dotted every street corner. The pieces were all there, but they were still just pieces. I had a theory, but I needed proof, And that proof, I was certain, lay in safe deposit box number 317. During this time, my relationship with Daniel continued to deteriorate. He was under pressure. I could see it in the tense set of his jaw, the dark circles under his eyes that even his youthful arrogance couldn't hide. I overheard snippets of hushed, frantic phone calls. Words like margin call, over-leveraged, and this deal has to work drifted from his study. He was playing with his father's money, but he lacked his father's cold, calculating patience. He was a gambler, and the house was starting to look shaky. One evening, he came to me, an unnerving, artificial smile plastered on his face. "Mom," he began, his tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "I've been thinking. This house, it's so big, so much upkeep. It must be a lot for you to handle, rattling around in here all by yourself." I stared at him, my heart turning to a small, cold stone in my chest. I knew what was coming. "There's a wonderful place, just outside of town," he continued, his voice smooth as oil. "Sunny Meadows. It's more of a community, really. They have gardens, activities, round-the-clock care. You'd be so much more comfortable there. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. A burden." The word screamed in the silence between us. He didn't say it, but he didn't have to. I was a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated. He wanted the house. He wanted to sell it, to cover his financial mistakes. He was willing to trade his mother for a bottom line. Lily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He didn't!" she cried, her voice full of outrage. "He didn't say that. Not my dad." I looked at my granddaughter, her innocent face clouded, with the difficult truth that people, even the people we love, are complicated and flawed. "He didn't see it that way, my love," I said softly. In his mind, he was being practical. He had learned from his father that everything and everyone has a price. He just didn't know what my price was. That was the moment. The final betrayal. It wasn't a burst of anger I felt, but a profound, chilling clarity. The time for hiding, for playing the part of the meek widow, was over. The time had come to claim what was mine. The next morning, I used a significant portion of my monthly stipend to hire a private car service. I dressed with meticulous care. I chose a simple, elegant navy blue dress, my mother's pearl earrings, and a string of pearls Arthur had given me for some long-forgotten anniversary. I looked every bit the dignified, respectable Mrs. Henderson. I wanted them to see me not as a frail old woman, but as a force to be reckoned with. The main branch of the global financial union was a testament to modern, impersonal wealth. A soaring atrium of glass and steel, it was designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant. I walked across the polished granite floor, my sensible shoes clicking with a purpose I hadn't felt in decades. I approached the customer. Service desk, my back straight, my chin held high. I presented the small brass key to a young, crisp-suited manager named Mr. Davies. He looked at the key, then at me, a flicker of polite skepticism in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "this is a very old key. Our systems are all electronic now. I'm not sure." "It's from the Merchants Trust Bank," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. Me. "Box number 317. I have reason to believe you are still the custodians of its contents." He frowned, intrigued despite himself. He typed something into his computer, his brow furrowing as he read the screen. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, under his breath. He looked up at me, his professional mask replaced by a genuine curiosity. "The old Merchants Trust vault is still in the sub-basement. It's mostly used for archival storage now. Very few of these boxes are still active. Please, wait here." He disappeared through a formidable-looking steel door. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I sat in a plush leather chair, my hands clasped in my lap, trying to control the frantic beating of my heart. What if it was empty? What if this was all a wild goose chase, a final cruel joke played by fate? I felt the weight of my entire life, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the lonely years, converging on this single moment. Finally, Mr. Davies returned. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He was no longer carrying just the key. In his hands, he held a long, narrow metal box, tarnished with age and covered in a fine layer of dust. He walked past the waiting area, straight to me. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice full of a bewildered awe that sent a shiver down my spine. "Perhaps we should step into my office. The secrets of the past are finally unlocked. What do you think is in that box besides just papers? Share your theories below. My son was preparing to send me to a nursing home, to file me away like an old receipt. But in that dusty box, my mother had left me an arsenal. And the first weapon, the sharpest, the one that would change everything, was a letter that finally explained the silence of my father and the cruelty of my aunt." Mr. Davies, the bank manager, slid a glass of water across the polished mahogany of his desk. His professional composure was gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, almost reverential awe. He looked at me as if I were a ghost who had just materialized in his office, a specter of history demanding its due. The safe deposit box sat open between us, its tarnished metal a stark contrast to the sleek, modern office. It didn't smell of money, it smelled of time itself, of faded ink and secrets kept under lock and key for more than half a century. Hands, which had been trembling with anticipation, were now perfectly still. I reached into the box, and my fingers brushed against a stack of documents, crisp and heavy, bound with a faded blue ribbon. These were the stock certificates, dozens of them. A silent army of wealth that had been fighting for me in the shadows all these years. Beneath them lay a thick, leather-bound journal and a slender, sealed envelope with my name, Marietta, written in my mother's elegant, looping script. The ink was faded, but the love in that single word was as vivid as the day it was. Written, "Would you like me to get you a financial advisor, Mrs. Henderson?" Mr. Davies asked, his voice hushed. "We have a team. The preliminary valuation of these portfolios is, well, it's substantial. Extremely substantial." I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the letter. The money was a tool, a means to an end. But this letter, this was the truth. This was the key to the lock that had been fastened around my heart for a lifetime. With a deep, steadying breath, I broke the wax seal. The letter was long, written on delicate, almost translucent paper. As I read my mother's words, the sterile bank office faded away, and I was plunged into a past I never knew, a story that rearranged the entire architecture of my life. "My dearest Marietta," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and the world has proven to be as cruel as I feared. But I pray you are also safe and strong, and that this box has found you when you needed it most. There is so much I never had the chance to tell you. My mother, Elspeth, was not the simple farmer's wife I remembered. She was born into a wealthy city family, the Dubois, who valued pedigree and profit above all else. When she fell in love with my father, a kind, handsome farmer with dirt under his nails and poetry in his soul, her family was appalled. They gave her an ultimatum: abandon him or be cut off, disowned and erased from the family legacy. My mother chose love. She walked away from a life of immense privilege to build a life of simple, profound happiness with my father. But one person in her family, a kinder uncle, couldn't bear to see her cast out completely. Before her wedding, he secretly established a trust in her name, a vast portfolio of stocks and properties, managed by a discreet family lawyer. It was her safety net, a secret she kept even from my father, not out of distrust, but to protect his pride. She wanted their life together to be theirs alone, built by their own two hands. The box, she wrote, was her insurance policy for me, her daughter, a legacy of freedom in case her life with my father wasn't enough to protect me. Then came the part that made the blood run cold in my veins. Shortly before the illness took her, my mother, sensing her time was short, had confided in her sister. She told Aunt Clara everything about the trust, the box, the key in the locket. She made her sister promise that if anything ever happened to her, Clara would ensure I was taken care of, that I would receive my inheritance when I came of age. She trusted her. Lily, sitting at my feet in the cozy firelight of the present, let out a small, wounded sound. Her little hands were clenched into fists. Aunt Clara knew, she whispered, her voice trembling with a child's pure fury. She knew the whole time. When she made you marry that awful man? I nodded, the memory of my aunt's triumphant smile at my wedding turning to ash in my mind. Yes, my darling, she knew. I continued with the story, my voice now low and hard. The letter was a confession from beyond the grave, a testament to a betrayal so deep it had poisoned 3 generations. Clara, consumed by a lifelong jealousy of my mother's beauty and her wealthy upbringing, saw her chance. My mother's death was her opportunity. She kept the secret, watching my father grieve, watching us struggle. She let him sink into debt, then presented him with a devil's bargain. She convinced him that marrying me off to Arthur Henderson was the only way, preying on his grief and his guilt. The farm, it turned out, was never truly in jeopardy. The deed in the box confirmed it. The land itself was part of my mother's trust. My father had been a tenant on his own wife's land. Without ever knowing it, Clara had orchestrated my entire life's tragedy for her own gain, likely siphoning profits from the farm's operations for years under the guise of helping my father manage it. My father's guilt, his inability to look me in the eye, suddenly made a terrible, heartbreaking sense. He wasn't just guilty for sacrificing me. He was haunted by the ghost of a wife whose memory he felt he had failed, manipulated by a sister-in-law he'd trusted. He was a victim too, in his own way. The letter ended with a mother's final, desperate plea. Do not let them break you, my Marietta. Do not let their greed extinguish your light. This wealth is not a reward. It is a shield and a sword. Use it to build a life of your own choosing, a life of joy and purpose. Live for me. Live freely. That is the only revenge that will ever truly matter. I folded the letter, my tears falling onto the ancient paper, mingling with my mother's faded ink. It was absolution and an indictment all at once. The anger I felt was a pure, cold flame. It wasn't the hot, reckless anger of my youth, but the focused, deliberate anger of an old woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Mr. Davies helped me contact a lawyer, a woman he recommended named Evelyn Albright. She was the senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious firms, a woman with a reputation for being as compassionate as she was brilliant. When I sat in her office the next day and told her my story, laying out the documents from the EE box, she listened without interruption, her intelligent eyes missing nothing. When I was finished, she looked at me, a glimmer of profound respect on her face. Mrs. Henderson, she said, her voice firm. Throughout my career, I have seen many forms of injustice. But this is a masterpiece of deception. We are not just going to reclaim your assets. We are going to reclaim your life. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn and her team worked with silent, stunning efficiency. The full extent of my mother's portfolio was uncovered. The Keystone stock was just the beginning. There were properties, bonds, and other investments that had blossomed in the shadows for 60 years. The numbers were astronomical, beyond anything I could have ever conceived. I was, by any measure, one of the wealthiest women in the state. But the most staggering discovery was about the land on which my marital home stood. The grand Henderson mansion, the symbol of Arthur's power and my gilded cage, was built on a parcel of land that was part of my mother's original trust. Arthur hadn't owned it, he had leased it, a 99-year lease from a holding company that was, in fact, an arm of my mother's trust. The lease was due to expire in 6 months. The very ground beneath Daniel's feet belonged to me. The day of the reckoning arrived. I asked Daniel to meet me in the formal living room, the one reserved for important guests. I also asked him to ensure he was alone. He strode in, radiating impatience, a frown etched on his face. "Mom, I'm in the middle of closing a big deal. What's so important? Did you reconsider Sunny Meadows? I can have the papers drawn up." "No, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and even. I was seated in my favorite armchair, a place where he was used to seeing me as a frail, peripheral figure. But today, I was the center of gravity in the room. Evelyn Albright sat in the chair beside me, a leather portfolio resting in her lap. "We need to discuss my living arrangements," said. "And yours." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "I thought we settled this. It's what's best for you." "Let's start with a different topic," I said, nodding to Evelyn. She opened the portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the coffee table. It was a summary of the current valuation of my mother's trust. Daniel glanced at it, then did a double take, his eyes widening in disbelief. He snatched the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he read the figure at the bottom. The color drained from his face. "What is this?" "A joke?" he stammered, looking from the paper to me, his arrogance crumbling into confusion. "That," I said quietly, "is my inheritance." "An inheritance your Aunt Clara and your father's greed stole from me 60 years ago." I told him everything. I told him about my mother's family, the trust, Aunt Clara's treachery, and the life I was supposed to have. I watched as his entire understanding of his world, of his family's history, was dismantled before his very eyes. He sank onto the sofa opposite me, the paper crinkling in his white-knuckled grip. He was speechless. "But the crowning jewel of my inheritance, Daniel," I continued, my voice as soft and sharp as a shard of ice, "is the most ironic part of all." Evelyn slid a second document across the table. It was the deed to the land. "This house, this monument to your father's ego, it's built on my land. The lease is almost up, which means everything on it, this house, the manicured lawns, the very foundation of the Henderson legacy, reverts to me." He stared at the deed, then at me, and for the first time, he truly saw me. Not as his mother, not as a dependent, not as a burden to be managed, but as the woman who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. The shock in his eyes gave way to a dawning, sickening horror. He was a trespasser in his own home. He finally found his voice, a ragged whisper. "What do you want?" I leaned forward, the full weight of my years, my sorrows, and my newfound power settling around me like a royal robe. I looked at my son, the boy I had loved so fiercely, the man who had discarded me so casually. My mother's words echoed in my heart, "Live freely. That is the only revenge that will ever truly matter." I wasn't going to destroy him. I was going to give him something far more challenging, a choice. "You told me I was a burden, Daniel," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the stunned silence of the room. "An inconvenience to be moved into a home and forgotten. So I am removing the inconvenience. You have 30 days to vacate my property. But because I am your mother, I am going to make you an offer. It's not one of forgiveness, not yet. It's one of consequence." The tables have turned. What kind of offer do you think Marietta will make to her son? A test? A challenge? Share your ideas in the comments. My son expected me to take everything from him, just as his family had taken everything from me. He was braced for ruin, for a vengeance 60 years in the making. But my mother's legacy wasn't about revenge. It was about building something new from the rubble of the old. And my offer to Daniel was not a punishment, but the laying of a new and very heavy foundation. Daniel stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. The silence in the grand, opulent living room was so profound, I could hear the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a second of his old life falling away. He was a man adrift, his entire world capsized in the space of 10 minutes. His arrogance, the armor he had worn his entire life, lay in shattered pieces at his feet. All that was left was the raw, terrified core of a man who had just discovered he was nothing. "Vacate?" he finally choked out, the word small and weak. "This is my home, my father's home." "Your father was a tenant, Daniel," I said, my voice gentle but unyielding. "A long-term tenant on my mother's land. The lease is over. The property reverts to me. This was never his home to give you." I let the words sink in, a final, undeniable truth. "But," I continued, leaning forward, "I said I would make you an offer. You have spent your life taking your inheritance for granted, taking my love for granted, taking my very presence in this house for granted. Now I am going to offer you the chance to give." Evelyn Albright, my lawyer, slid a third and final folder across the table. It was thicker than the others. "I am not selling this house," I explained. "Its foundation is soaked in too much sorrow to be a home any longer. Instead, it will be given a new purpose. It will become the headquarters for the Elspeth Dubois Foundation." "The what?" Daniel whispered, looking at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "A foundation in my mother's name," I said, a warmth spreading through my chest as I spoke the words aloud. "It will be dedicated to providing second chances. We will offer legal aid, educational grants, and business startup funds to women who have been marginalized, betrayed, or cheated out of their own futures. Women like me." I saw a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just calculating dread, in his eyes. He was beginning to see the shape of the cage I was building for him. It was not a cage of bars and locks, but one of purpose and responsibility. "And what does that have to do with me?" he asked, his voice rough with defiance. "You have a choice," I said. "You can take the 30 days, walk out of that door with whatever you can carry, and start over from scratch. Given your recent financial decisions, I imagine that will be difficult. Or you can accept my offer. You can work for the foundation." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Work for you? As what? The janitor?" "No," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Your title will be case reviewer. You will be given a small office in the back of the house, your father's old smoking room, I think. You will be paid a modest, livable salary. And your job, Daniel, your only job, will be to read the stories. You will be the first person to review every single application that comes through our doors. You will sit in that room day after day, and you will read about women who have been left with nothing. Women whose husbands have emptied their bank accounts. Women whose families have cast them aside. You will listen to their stories, Daniel. You will bear witness to their pain. That will be your burden, the burden of empathy." I let the terms settle. "You will do this for 1 year. No shortcuts, no special treatment. At the end of that year, if you have done the work, if you have truly shouldered that burden, then we can talk about what comes next for us, as mother and son. If not, the original offer stands. You are free to leave. The choice is entirely yours." He was trapped. I could see the war raging behind his eyes. His pride, the Henderson arrogance that had been bred into him, recoiled at the thought of such a menial, emotionally taxing job. But his pragmatism, the cold, hard logic his father had taught him, was doing the math. He was ruined financially. He had nowhere to go. This was his only lifeline. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for a hint of malice, of victorious gloating. He found none. All he saw was a quiet, unshakable resolve. He finally slumped back against the sofa, the fight draining out of him. "I accept," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The months that followed were a period of profound transformation for the house and for my son. The ornate, soulless furniture was sold off, replaced by functional desks and comfortable chairs. The ballroom, where I had once stood like a mannequin at Arthur's business parties, was converted into a sun-filled library and resource center for women. Laughter began to fill the halls, not the boisterous, empty laughter of Daniel's business partners, but the warm, hopeful laughter of women finding their footing again. The entire mansion was reborn, its cold marble heart replaced with a warm, beating one. I did not stay there. My victory was not in claiming the mansion, but in liberating myself from it. I used a small fraction of my newfound resources to buy back my father's old farm, the land he had so desperately tried to save. The old farmhouse was dilapidated, but I had it restored, not to its former state, but to a cozy, comfortable cottage. It was there, surrounded by the scent of pine and damp earth, with my mother's locket resting against my heart, that I finally, truly, came home. Daniel, meanwhile, began his sentence. At first, he was sullen and withdrawn, performing his duties with a detached, mechanical efficiency. He would emerge from his office at the end of the day with his jaw tight, his eyes haunted. The stories, I knew, were taking their toll. He was being forced to confront a world of pain he never knew existed. The change came slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started with small things. He began referring to the applicants by their names, not their case numbers. He argued with the board one day, advocating passionately for a single mother who needed a grant to finish her nursing degree, his voice cracking with an emotion I had never heard from him before. One evening, about 6 months into his tenure, he came to visit me at the cottage. It was the first time he had sought me out for anything other than a necessity. He looked tired, but the hardness in his eyes had softened. He sat at my small kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea. "I read a story today," he said, his voice quiet. A woman whose sister stole her inheritance after their parents died. Convinced her she was a burden and had her institutionalized so she could sell off the family property. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. It was Aunt Clara. It was you. All over again." He finally broke, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he wept. "I never knew. I never saw you. I'm so sorry." In that moment, he was no longer Arthur Henderson's arrogant son. He was just Daniel, my boy, lost and broken, and finally finding his way home. I went to him and wrapped my arms around him, holding him as I had when he was a child, his tears soaking the shoulder of my cardigan. The burden had finally broken him open, and from that brokenness, something new could finally grow. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, golden glow on Lily's face. She had been listening with rapt attention, her expression shifting from outrage to sorrow to a final, quiet understanding. The story was over. My long journey through the shadows was complete. "So, Dad, he's good now?" she asked, her innocent question holding the weight of the entire saga. I smiled, pulling the soft woolen blanket a little tighter around her shoulders. Just then, the cottage door opened, letting in a swirl of crisp autumn air. It was Daniel. He was older now, his hair flecked with gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes etched not by stress, but by a deep and abiding compassion. He smiled. When he saw us, it was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "Am I interrupting story time?" he asked, his voice warm. He came over and kissed the top of Lily's head, then looked at me. There was a universe of understanding in that single glance. He had shouldered his burden, and it had transformed him. He now ran the Elspeth Dubois Foundation, not as an heir, but as a devoted custodian, his life's work to give others the chances his mother had been denied. Our relationship wasn't perfect, scars that deep never fully vanish, but it was real. It was forged in the fires of truth and rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect. He was no longer my burden, and I was no longer his. We were simply mother and son. "We were just finishing," I said, my heart full. I turned my gaze back to my granddaughter, my beautiful Lily, the future of our family. I took her small hands in my wrinkled ones, feeling the unbroken line that stretched from my mother to me, to her. "My mother's letter taught me the most important lesson of all, my sweet girl," I said, my voice soft but clear in the firelight. "Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Revenge is a cage, just like the one I lived in for all those years. True freedom, true power, is in choosing to build, not to break. It's in choosing to plant, a garden where others have sown only weeds." I looked around my little cottage, at the dancing flames, at my son's kind face, at my granddaughter's bright, hopeful eyes. I had all the money in the world, but this was true wealth, peace, family, a legacy not of gold, but of goodness. "So you see, my sweet Lily," I whispered, pulling her into a gentle hug, the locket pressing warmly between us. "They tried to bury me. They tried to tell me I was a burden, something to be discarded. But they didn't know I was a seed. Never, ever let anyone else define your worth. Your story is yours and yours alone to write. So you make sure you write a beautiful one." The fire crackled, a final, warm punctuation to a story of a long winter and a hard-won spring. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of a new day. And in the quiet comfort of the cottage, 3 generations sat together, bound by the enduring strength of a love that had refused to be forgotten. Every family has its secrets and its strengths. What's a lesson you've learned from your parents or grandparents that has stayed with you? Share your story in the comments below, and let's celebrate the wisdom that is passed down through generations.